South Korea's president concluding his first summit with his American counterpart, highlighting new pledges on defense and regional cooperation. Even so, analysts say important issues on trade and security are yet to be resolved. And more on that summit in Washington, we now bring in Ramon Pacheco Pardo. He's Professor of International Relations at King's College London. Professor Pardo, we've seen more than 7 months of Mr. Trump as in his second term in office. We've seen absolute diplomatic ruptures with the Ukrainian leader in February, the South African leader in May of this year. So we have a template for what counts as diplomatic, relative failure. In that context, how would you rate this summit between President Myung and President Donald Trump?
Well, I think that from a South Korean perspective, this has been a successful summit. First of all, because of what you just mentioned, the fact that there was no spat between the two leaders. Not only that, we saw that the private meeting that the two leaders held went over time with no show of dissent. But I think also what we have seen is that President Trump hasn't raised the issue of tariffs, which some South Korean analysts thought could have happened if he wouldn't have been satisfied with the agreement that the two countries reached a few weeks ago. And as you have just indicated, other countries such as India are facing higher tariffs, and South Korea is the opposite. Tariffs are being lowered. So I think overall South Korea is very satisfied with this summit, how it went.
But South Korea would be concerned, and rightly so, if America reduces or removes its security presence in South Korea. We've got 28,000 troops stationed there, helping South Korea deter any North Korean offensive moves. We had no confirmation and no reassurances on that front, did we?
That is true, and I think this is something that is it's already been discussed at the working level between the two countries and will continue to be discussed. I wasn't expecting a resolution of this issue because we know that summits with President Trump are not about the details, are more about the big headlines. And I do think that from a South Korean perspective, the question of so-called strategic flexibility, how many U.S. troops are going to remain in the Korean Peninsula, is their main purpose going to be to deter China rather than North Korea? That's one of the top issues to be discussed with the US over the next few months. Do you also see some voices in South Korea, though, indicating that it is not about the number of troops that the US may have on a permanent basis in South Korea? It is more about their use, whether they focus only on China, only on North Korea, or on both countries. And I think this is going to be one of the big discussions that we're going to have between the two countries, between the two governments moving forward.
This strategic flexibility, and this bears repeat mention from me, because this is the concern that the U.S. might want some of these 28,500 troops to be redeployed elsewhere away from the Korean Peninsula. South Korea is very anxious that does not in fact happen. And earlier, our correspondent was in her report to us saying that one issue that should have been raised, could have been raised, and was not in fact raised, is where the U.S. and South Korea might stand on any moves from China, and that pertains to this strategic flexibility. Does that concern you that China was not explicitly raised as an issue in this summit?
I think from a South Korean perspective, their delegation visiting Washington wouldn't have liked for this to be openly discussed. Of course, there are many meetings taking place on the sidelines of the main summit between Presidents Myung and Trump. But I do think that this is an issue on which the two sides will try to reach an agreement fairly quickly. We have seen that both Australia and Japan are already discussing this matter with the US. I think the US wants clarity, but I do think, as I mentioned, that South Korea wouldn't have been comfortable with this being raised by President Trump directly with President Myung, because they think this is something that needs to be discussed, first of all, at the working level, and later on it can be discussed at a higher level. I think there's another component to this, which is obviously South Korea is trying to change its relationship with China to make it less confrontational than it was over the past few years. And I think any public mention of China during the meeting between the two presidents, the US president and the South Korean president, would have created frictions with China. And I think that the South Korean side wanted to avoid those frictions with China as well.
All right, final question, Professor Pardo. And some concerns just hours before the summit. We had Mr. Trump posting on his social media site, what is going on in South Korea seems like a purge or revolution. We can't have that happening. The US wants to do business with South Korea and it cannot deal with an environment like that. So where did that go, that concern? Was that walked back or was that just dismissed in the summit? Final question.
I think it's quite interesting because it was actually dismissed during the press availability that the two presidents had before the summit itself, the summit properly, in that a journalist asked this question. President Trump actually said that he thought this probably was a misunderstanding. President Myung explained the position of his country, that this is an issue on which the government has no say. And then it wasn't raised again. And then we have seen that after the summit, there have been no more messaging from the US in this direction. So it seems that it's something that came out of the blue from a South Korean perspective. They were not expecting this because this is a message more from fringe right-wing groups in South Korea and the US. But it seems not to have had an impact on the summit itself and now on the aftermath of the summit as we are seeing today.
Well, thanks so much. Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College London.